In this lecture, we're going to check the player's inventory from the NPC. Before we get into it, I want to review the data flow. Previously, we communicated between objects with events. However, this time, things will be different. Unlike before, our game objects must return a response. Communication has always been one direction. One object raises the event. The other object would handle the event. However, the UI is going to need a response from the NPC. Returning data from events is not a common practice. So, rather than using events, we're going to grab the game object. On the game object, we're going to call a method to get return data. So far, we've only communicated between the NPC and the UI. It's time to include the player in the mix. The first step is to define a method from the inventory component. This component has been added to the player. From our NPC, we're going to call a method from this component to check the player's inventory. At the bottom of the class, define a public method called hasItem. The return value of this method will be a Boolean. In this method, we're going to check the player's inventory for a specific item. Before we can do so, we need to know which item to look for. Let's accept that information as a parameter. The name of the parameter will be called desired item. Its type will be the quest item SO. Next, let's create a variable for storing the status of the item being found. Define a Boolean variable called itemFound with an initial value of false. After defining the variable, let's return it from the method. The next step is to loop through the items variable. On each iteration, we'll compare the item from the current iteration with the desired item parameter. If the items match, we can update the itemFound variable to true. Thus, our method can inform the NPC that the player has the item. After defining the variable, let's add the loop, called the items.forEach method. As a reminder, the item variable is a list. We can call the forEach method to perform a loop on a list. The next step is to pass in a function to the forEach method. This function will be responsible for handling each iteration of the loop. In the compareItems function, we're using two variables called desired item and itemFound. However, these variables do not exist within the scope of the compareItems function. They're only available to the hasItem method. Therefore, we can't outsource the logic to a separate method. Nor can we pass on this information to the method from the forEach method. So, how can we loop through the items? We don't have to pass in the name of the method. We can write it directly from the loop. In the forEach method, add a lambda expression. Sometimes, you may hear lambda expressions referred to as arrow functions. This is because we're using a fat arrow to write the function. Previously, we learned that lambda expressions are methods without a name. There's one advantage that lambda expressions have over regular methods. They can access the data from outside the expression. This lambda expression has access to the desired item parameter and itemFound variable. We'll be able to update the local variables from within the lambda expression. Whenever possible, I prefer to outsource the logic of a loop into a separate method. However, if I need to access the data from a method, I will use a lambda expression. That's a rule of thumb I follow. You don't have to follow this practice. In the parameter list of the expression, let's add a parameter called item. Its type will be the quest item SO class. The lambda expression will be called on each iteration of the loop. It'll be provided the item from the current iteration as a parameter. Inside the body of the expression, add a conditional statement with the following condition: desired item.name equals item.name. In this condition, we're comparing the names of both items. If there's a match, the player has the quest item. In the body of the conditional, let's set the itemFound variable to true. The method is ready. It should be able to tell the NPC that an item has been found. The next step is to call this method from the NPC. Open the NPC controller. At the top of the file, add the rpg.utility namespace. We're including this namespace for access to our constants. The NPC is going to need to grab the player by their tag. In an earlier section, we added a constant for the player's tag to prevent typos. After including this namespace, scroll to the checkPlayer method. In this method, we're automatically returning true. Now that we have a method for checking the player's inventory, we can call it for an accurate result. First, we need the component. Define a variable called inventoryComponent with the inventory class as the type. The value is going to be very long. Set it to the following: GameObject.findGameObject with tag constants .playerTag.getComponentInventory. The line we've written grabs the player by their tag. After grabbing the player, we're grabbing the inventory component with the getComponent method. After grabbing the component, the return statement can be updated to return the value from the inventoryComponent.hasItem method. This method requires the item to search for. Let's pass in the desired item variable from the NPC. Great! The dialog state will receive this information. By having this information, our story will be able to load the correct knots. In the next lecture, let's update the story to use this information.